With the video game market projected to reach a cumulative value of $446.4 billion in 2032, and being one of the biggest titans in the entertainment industry, we would like to talk to you about the history of this entertainment industry giant. My name is Julian with Matt Cleaver, and we would like to tell you the history of the console wars and how the video game industry grew into the giant it is today.
At first there was nothing. Kids in the early 70s are left kicking rocks and playing jacks. Then boom! The first ever video game console ever released came out in 1972, the Magnavox Odyssey. The Odyssey was the first major player in the video game space, and it is pretty primitive by today's standards. The system had cartridges, but they didn't have any data on them. The system had all the games pre-installed on the system, and the game cards acted as access to the games already on the system. The Magnavox had some competition in the form of other systems that had a few games baked into them without the use of cartridges. These systems consist of Atari's home Pong system, the Coleco Telstar series of systems, and Nintendo's Color TV game series of systems. These systems are pretty primitive by today's standards, being reskins of Pong consoles and different types of Pong-esque games. But the start of the console wars can be first linked to Atari versus Intellivision.
The Atari 2600 hit the scene in 1977, and this system took what the Odyssey was trying to do and made it a reality. Atari developed cartridges that held the game data on them, so you weren't stuck with the same old Pong clone for every game with just a different sticker covering your TV. Prior to 1979, there were no third-party developers, meaning Atari published all their games in-house for the system. This ended with the formation of Activision, a company formed by 4 former Atari employees. Due to their familiarity with Atari's cartridges, Activision created the first third-party games for the system. This caused a plethora of third-party developers to penetrate the market. That same year, Mattel decided to get a piece of the emerging video game pie with their own system, the Intellivision. And they had some very compelling games on their side to combat Atari. Mattel gained the license to Nintendo's Donkey Kong, on top of having better graphics and sound. Mattel used this to their advantage, heavily pushing these aspects of the Intellivision advertising. This is the first instance of marketing tactics that companies like Sega and Nintendo would use to get back at the other company. However, this marketing tactic did not work that well for Intellivision, which only sold around 3.75 million units compared to the 2600's colossal 30 million units sold. This really shows how much of a lead Atari had at the time in the video game space. But despite Atari selling this many units, the oversaturation of quick and cheap games led to the video game market crash of 1983. This leads into the next instance of the console wars, and one of the most impactful ones, Nintendo versus Sega.
2 years after the crash, Nintendo entered the home console space in a huge way by releasing the Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the NES. It's the most iconic console of all time, and is the reason why Grandma still calls every video game console a Nintendo.
So the console wars really started when Nintendo released their NES. Before that, it was largely just Atari and Amiga and stuff like that, Commodore 64, and the Apple IIe.
Sega also released a system a year later called the Master System, which was trampled compared to Nintendo's complete market domination at the time. Sega just couldn't compete with Mario, Link, Samus, and many of Nintendo's huge IPs, along with massive third-party support from companies like Konami, Squaresoft, and Capcom releasing games for the gaming giant. But Sega, trying to get an edge on Nintendo, released the Sega Genesis in 1989, the first real 16-bit console to be released. But even with the graphics update, Sega was still missing the magic that Nintendo had with Mario and others. Then in June of 1991, Sega released the original Sonic the Hedgehog, and this is what Sega needed to get their name on the map. Sonic was a smash hit for Sega, being this edgy and cool hedgehog, and being really fast compared to the slow and fat Italian plumber over on Team Red. Sonic offered gameplay that just wasn't available on Nintendo's platform, due in part by the better graphics and processing power the Genesis had, leading Sega to slowly start catching up to Nintendo's massive lead in the gaming space. Sega uses these qualities in one of the most iconic video game marketing campaigns with the slogan, "Sega does what Nintendo don't," which probably made thousands of kids in the 90s want to switch over to Team Sega single-handedly.
But in September of that same year, Nintendo released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the SNES for short. Nintendo's newest system had graphics on par with and even slightly above Sega's system. This led to many ads comparing the two systems using words like blast processing and other marketing lingo that didn't really mean anything. Both systems had massive third-party support, and both got versions of the same game, with the SNES mostly beating out the Genesis in the quality of multi-platform games. Sega, trying to compete with Nintendo's lead in processing power, released multiple add-ons for the Genesis. Sega first released an add-on called the Sega CD, which was the most successful of the add-ons, even if it didn't change Sega's market share by all that much. The Sega CD had many exclusive games and was more graphically impressive due to the capabilities of the CD, and even with an exclusive Sonic title releasing on the platform. Sega also released another add-on called the Sega 32X. This was supposed to be a console to hold off consumers until Sega's next main home console, but it was later released and turned into an add-on for the Genesis. These add-ons didn't really sell that well due to the cost of them. These add-ons cost almost as much or even more than the system itself, and you still had to buy games for them. This ended up to be Sega's downfall, and they never really gained the same success they had with the Genesis. The Genesis sold a little over 35 million units compared to the SNES's 50 million units sold. The SNES was no nonsense with the lack of add-ons and kept things simple for the consumer, along with stellar titles like Super Mario World, F-Zero, Super Metroid, Star Fox, and Donkey Kong Country, just to name a few. The SNES also had overall better quality third-party support, making it keep the lead they had over Sega.
But Nintendo did try to make an add-on, and this is a crucial moment in the history of the console wars. In 1992, Nintendo was in talks with Sony to create a CD add-on for the SNES called the Nintendo PlayStation. Nintendo wasn't happy with the terms of their agreement with Sony and later scrapped the add-on system altogether.
I don't know if you've ever seen anybody with an NES or an N64, but all of those consoles were cartridge based, and but you had to like blow into them to get them to work sometimes. It was crazy.
Yeah.
The Sony PlayStation was really one of the first disc-based systems, and it allowed, because the density storage on a disc was much higher, it allowed for much better quality graphics because load times would go way down and you had that much more storage capability. So
in 1993, the hype for the newest generation of video game consoles was at an all-time high. Sega is on the verge of releasing their newest CD-based system called the Sega Saturn, and Sony, tired of getting snubbed, decides to release their first home console and one of the best-selling consoles of all time, the Sony PlayStation.
Sega was off to a rocky start, with the Saturn having a choppy internal development, with Sega of America forced to release the console early when there was very little games for the launch lineup. The launch was so rushed that on May 12th, 1995, the day of E3, the biggest gaming conference in America, the CEO of Sega of America walks on stage and starts gassing up the Saturn's features, then drops a bombshell that the Saturn released yesterday when it was supposed to come out in late September of that year, along with announcing that the Saturn is $400, which is almost $800 today, made many consumers confused and stores mad that it was just dropped randomly without warning, and causing some stores to outright refuse to sell the system. Sony already had a massive advantage over Sega, being the new kid on the block and bashing Sega at E3 in the marketing for the PlayStation. The PlayStation, later released in fall of 1994, was a smash hit for consumers and gamers alike. The PlayStation being able to play CDs made it the killer app at the time, and everybody wanted one. The Nintendo 64 was announced earlier that same year and wouldn't come out for over a year later. This gave Sony a huge leg up on Nintendo because the PS1 came out almost 2 years before the Nintendo 64 would hit store shelves in September of 1996.
Along with the Nintendo 64 sticking to cartridges when developers were itching to implement CD-quality soundtracks and those corny FMVs, the CD also allowed for games to be longer, and these factors led to the Nintendo 64 to have a very lackluster third-party support, despite Nintendo giving it their all in first-party support for the platform. Sony also had better marketing in this generation. A standout is the Crash Bandicoot ads, where he shows up to Nintendo HQ in Japan and yells at them through a megaphone. Nintendo had advertisements, but they weren't attacking the competition like Sony was, and was more weird and geared to how the Nintendo 64 was the console to get. The PlayStation 1 is the clear winner in this generation, with over 102 million units sold compared to Nintendo's 32 million and Sega's measly 9 million units sold, which just shows how dominant Sony was during this generation, even though it was their first go at the home console market.
The next generation of home consoles and beyond focused less and less on this competitive aspect. PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and Dreamcast generation of consoles is not to be overlooked though. This generation sees the end of Sega's home console development with the Dreamcast. The PlayStation 2 was such a beast, it is still the highest selling console of all time. The combo of it being a sequel to the highest selling console of all time at the time, and being a DVD player where DVDs were really popular, along with the players for them being very expensive, made the PlayStation 2 the hot ticket item in the early 2000s, and making it the most successful video game console of all time. Microsoft also entered the console space this generation with the original Xbox outselling Nintendo's system, but still paling in comparison to Sony sales.
Beyond this point, the big three of Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony became more buddy-buddy with each other and started focusing on their own thing. During the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, it was really just PlayStation and Xbox being neck and neck in sales the entire generation, while Nintendo dominated with the Wii and was in their own market. This continued till this day, but Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo are more open to working together, with Nintendo's Smash Bros. Crossover fighting game having icons from both Team Blue and Green. Along with the shift companies are taking towards mobile gaming, the console wars are taking a back seat for the mobile revolution that really started picking up in the early 2010s.
There are some times when you want to sit down and play like a really complicated game where you're managing lots of variables and different strategies, and there's other times when you just want to pop bubbles. And like, both of those are legitimate sort of uses for gaming.
Thank you all so much for watching our documentary on the console wars and its effect on the video game market. Thank you again, and get gaming, H-Vision.